So tensions are growing between Venezuela and Guyana. Guyana, of course, is a former British colony, and we have a close partnership with that country in the region. But what caught my attention in online videos about this was WION News and its offshoot Gravitas. Now that's interesting. You know, the word gravitas means thoughtful and in depth, and in my opinion, it's anything but. Um, I basically consider WION News to be an anti-West mouthpiece. Their headline, the rather obnoxious headline, was Britain's grandstanding over this issue, on the grounds that the Royal Navy has been deployed there to support our ally, Guyana. Now, an important bit of background to this case, there is a long-standing dispute between Venezuela and Guyana over the Essequibo territory, the Essequibo region. Um, but it's long been under control of Guyana, and in 2018, the International Courts of Justice ruled in favour of Guyana. And very significantly, South America's largest country, Brazil, supports the Guyanese position. I'm not sure what position other Latin American countries have taken, but that's significant. Brazil supports the Guyanese position, so does the United States. Um, Here's my take. I'm not going to talk so much about this crisis because it's be ongoing. I'm sure there'll be more things to say. I hope it doesn't escalate into a full scale war. I hope it can be resolved peacefully. Um, but firstly, Venezuela is a failed state. Under Chavez and now Maduro, it's a completely failed state. Rampant crime levels, severe poverty. It's a complete failed experiment. Um, and Maduro's a dictator. This is a guy who didn't accept the results of the presidential election. He's clung on to power, and I think, like a lot of dictators, he's using this as a way to sort of distract from domestic woes. Um, but that having been said, I want to talk about the angle that WION News is taking now. If it was just this issue, that wouldn't be significant. A lot of networks will be covering this. But I watched a Nigerian news broadcast on this, and granted, it was only a little snippet, it was 30 seconds, and they just reported it. They just reported it as a news. So Britain's deploying the Royal Navy there to support Guyana. No pontificating, no punditry, just reporting the facts. WION News, can't expect that from them. I think WION News is basically the new RT. Um, Now, we've got better relations with India than we do with Russia, that goes without saying. But personally, I don't know how much we can trust India, um, because I do think that if a country's TV, like news broadcasters or anything to go by, there is quite hostile anti-West sentiments in a lot of Indian networks. Now, I don't consider India to be China. India's a democracy. There will be different voices there. And NDTV, which is a bigger network, I don't think it's quite as jingoistic as the likes of WION News. But this reminds me of a piece I read in The Economist a few months ago. It's from August, from this edition. Um, the Economist is a pretty respected publication. Banyan, that's their op-ed piece on Asian affairs. But I'm going to just read this out because I think it's significant. Banyan, World on the Box. What foreign news coverage reveals about how Indians see the world. Now, of course, this is talking about how these networks have an influence. I don't think we can really say that 1.4 billion people all think alike. Of course not. But anyway, I'll just read this out. When Narendra Modi visited Washington in June, Indian cable news channels spent days discussing the country's foreign policy priorities and influence. This represents a significant change. The most popular shows, which consist of a studio host and supporters of the Hindu nationalist Prime Minister jointly browbeating his critics, used to be devoted to domestic issues. Yet, in recent years, they have made room for foreign policy discussion too. Much of the credit for expanding Indian media's horizons goes to Mr. Modi and his Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar, who have skillfully linked foreign and domestic interests. What happens in the world outside, they explain, affects India's future as a rising power. Well, that's true enough. I wouldn't say they're wrong about that. Um, Mr. Modi has also given the channels a lot to discuss. A visit to France and the United Arab Emirates in July was his 72nd foreign outing. India's presidency of the G20 has brought the world even closer. And I think this was published before that big summit in New Delhi. Um, Meetings have been scheduled in over 30 cities, all of which are now festooned with G20 paraphernalia. Yet it is hard to detect much deep interest in or knowledge of the world in these developments. There are probably fewer Indian foreign correspondents today than 2 decades ago, notes Sanjaya Baru, a former editor of the Business Standard, a broadsheet. The new media focus on India's role in the world tends to be hyper-partisan, nationalistic, and often stunningly ill-informed. And I'd agree with that. Certainly, WION News is that way. This represents a business opportunity that Subhash Chandra, a media magnate, has seized on. In 2016, he launched WION, or World as One News, such an ironic title, to cover the world from an Indian perspective. It was such a hit that its primetime host Palki Sharma was poached by a rival network to start a similar show. What is the Indian perspective? Watch Miss Sharma and the message emerges. Everywhere else is terrible. Both on WION and at her new home Network 18, Ms. Sharma relentlessly bashes China and Pakistan. Given India's history of conflict with the two countries, that is hardly surprising. Yet she also castigates the West, with which India has cordial relations. Europe is taunted as weak, irrelevant, dependent on America, and suffering from a colonial mindset. America is a violent, racist, dysfunctional place, an aging and irresponsible imperial power. This is not an exaggeration of the confident, this is not an expression of the confident new India Mr. Modi claims to represent. Mindful of the criticism India often draws, especially from Mr. Modi's Muslim bashing and creeping authoritarianism, and Sharma and other pro-Modi pundits insist that India's behaviour and its problems are no more worse than other countries. Yeah, except in other countries you don't get hundreds of people being killed in religious violence, at least not in Western countries. A report on the recent riots in France on Ms. Sharma's show included a claim that the French Interior Ministry was intending to suspend the internet in an attempt to curb violence. And thank God it is in Europe. If it was elsewhere, it would have been a human rights violation, she sneered. In fact, India leads the world in shutting down the internet for security and other reasons. And this is the world's biggest democracy we're talking about. The French Interior Ministry had anyway denied the claim a day before the show aired, so they didn't even put a disclaimer, as all professional networks should do. This was what they said, to offer an alternative point of view. Bridling at lectures by hypocritical foreign powers is a long-standing feature of Indian diplomacy, yet the new foreign news coverage is hyper-defensive champion of Mr. Modi, and its contrast with the self-confident new India the Prime Minister describes are novel and striking. Such coverage has two aims, says Manisha Pandey of News Laundry, a media watching website, to position Mr. Modi as a global leader who's put India on the map, and to promote the theory that there is a global conspiracy to keep India down. Interestingly enough, this is not unlike the sentiments of Chinese nationalists. Coverage is driven by the fact that most TV news anchors are propagandists for the current government. This may be fueling suspicion of the outside world, especially the West. In a recent survey by Morning Consult, Indians identified China as their country's biggest military threat. Well, that's not surprising. America was next on the list. A survey by the Pew Research Center found confidence in the American president at highest level since the Obama years, but negative views were also at the highest since Pew started asking the question, with somewhat contradictory results. That is at odds with Mr. Modi's aim to deepen ties with the West, and nationalists are seldom able to control the forces they unleash. China has recently sought to tamp down its aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy rhetoric, but social media remains mired in nationalism. Mr. Modi, a vigorous champion for India abroad, should take note. By letting his propaganda strum up hostility to the world, he is laying a trap for himself. Well, here's the thing. I think certainly the British government has went out of its way to have good relations with India. In fact, this is the cover of the Spectator, and it kind of shows that Sunak is basically being led by Modi. Spectator is a more conservative publication. But here's my issue. India is an emerging power. It's a fast growing power, fast growing economy, and there are things it should be proud of. But as a Westerner and as a British citizen, I'm a little bit fed up of the constant West bashing. I'm fed up of the constant Britain bashing from the likes of WION News. Now, they might say, but the BBC criticises India, it covers things like the Manipur violence. Yes, that's true, but there isn't the same level of animosity. You can say they do that, but they also have positive coverage. When that lunar probe happened, the BBC primarily covered that in a positive way, but Indian nationalists ignore that fact. I'm sick of the sensitivity and I'm sick of the jingoism. And I'm sick of the likes of Palki Sharma stirring up animosity towards my country and the West more broadly. Now, the reason the Royal Navy has moved into Guyana is simply to support our ally. This is not warmongering, this is supporting their position. It is Venezuela that has escalated the problem. This was something that was settled by the International Courts of Justice. Venezuela, not surprisingly, doesn't recognize that, but it shows that it's an isolated state. The reason Venezuela is in the mess it's in is not because of the CIA, it's not because of the West, it's because of the terrible, terrible leadership of Chavez and Maduro. Um, and this brings me to a few points. Brazil is a member of the BRICS, India is a member of the BRICS. Well, the fact that Brazil supports a Guyana position shows that the BRICS are not united, But I do wonder, why is Palki Sharma not condemning Britain? Um, well, actually, in the Gravitas report, it wasn't her, it was another correspondent. But, why are they not attacking Brazil's position? Brazil's a major regional power. So why are they not attacking Brazil's position? Could it be because Brazil is a fellow BRICS member? Um, you know, India's pandering to Russia raises a lot of questions. Why? Why is it that the world's biggest democracy cannot condemn the Russian tyrant? That's a failure of leadership. Um, and I think going forward, Britain should continue to be diplomatic. We should continue to push for good relations. But I do think that if this continued hyper nationalism keeps up, um, some of these networks have direct links to Modi. They're Modi propagandists. I do think that discreetly, maybe British diplomats should bring this up and, frankly, have a bit more backbone and say, look, we're not happy with this constant smearing of our country. Do you want good relations or do you want to constantly be attacking us? Um, this is not to say that India has to support the positions of the West, but nor should it be constantly in a position of animosity. On the Ukraine issue, for example, India feigns neutrality. Well, when they fail to condemn Russia, when they routinely have nationalist media mouthpieces attacking the Western position, even grotesquely and falsely blaming NATO for this war, which is just a shameless act of propaganda worthy of RT. Um, that's not a neutral position. So I find it hard to see India as neutral on this. And that then gets into a question, how deeply should we be tied with India? I don't see India as China. I think we are still in a position where we can have good relations. And I think we should go in a spirit of diplomacy and good relations. Give India the respect it has earned as a great power. But I don't think that we should approach our relations with India through this constant kind of prism of imperial, post imperial guilt. And I don't think we should be okay with nationalist mouthpieces like WION News, so called news, spewing out what in some cases is just false narratives. Um, I'm fed up with it. And you know, it could be there could actually be some jealousy here because the BBC, okay, it's much older, but it is a much bigger network. It has millions of subscribers, it has millions of views, it has a huge workforce. It's much bigger than We All News, so there might actually be some. I mean, We All News doesn't strike me as a confident network. It strikes me as insecure, nationalistic, always lashing out. and never simply reporting the news. Rather, it's constant punditry. I prefer networks that just report the news, just say this is what's happened, these are the details, these are the facts, not saying this is our opinion. And people can say what they want about the BBC, but I do think that there is less punditry on the BBC than on other networks, and I'm including other British networks. I mean, if you look at GB News compared to the BBC, there is less punditry on the BBC. This is not to say that the Beeb is perfect, far from it. I've been very critical of the Beeb. I think there's a left wing bias there. In fact, if anything, you'd find that the BBC would be first to kind of go to that post imperial guilt thing. Um, but, Whale News, I don't want to give it more importance than it deserves. It's not a major network. I mean, considering India is now the world's most populous country, Whale News, even within India, I don't think it's the biggest network. I think NDTV is bigger. NDTV, I don't mind. I have access to that on my TV, and it tends to be more balanced overall. There are sometimes rigorous debates there, but it doesn't have the hyper nationalism that Whale News does. um, that's a good thing. And one thing I will say, I'll close on an optimistic note or a more positive note. India is a democracy. There are many voices in India, and it would be wrong to look at a country of 1.4 billion people through the prism of this nationalist mouthpiece. But it is ugly, and I think it, looks a lot like RT. RT likewise was constantly attacking the West. It was constantly pushing an anti-West narrative. It was using conspiracy theories and holding them up as news. It was absolutely built on punditry, um, and it was a joke. It still has its toxic influence in some parts of the world, but I think we've done the right thing getting it off our airwaves. Why? Because why should we allow the enemy to flood our airwaves with propaganda and false narratives? You know, um, why should we allow a network that very much takes part in Putin's tyranny, including the putting down of his domestic rivals? Why should we give them any legitimacy as a news source? RT is not a legitimate news source. And I think WION News, so called, there's a lot of resemblances there. Um, Now, I'm not proposing that we take WION News off British Airwaves. Actually, at the moment, it isn't even on terrestrial TV, it's just kind of on the internet. So I wouldn't propose that because, of course, that would just lead to victimhood claims. But I do think if this continues, if these networks continue pumping out this anti-West bile, I do think it should be a matter for. I'm not talking about publicly, but Modi claims that he wants good relations with the West. Let him prove it. Let him prove it. Why should it always be the West having to respect India? That should be a two-way thing. What's Modi done to show that he respects the West? What's his government done to show that it respects the West? It works both ways. And if his mouthpieces are constantly pontificating against the West, then it counters his message that he wants good relations. It's a contradiction. So maybe he should rein in on it, you know, um, if he can. Anyway, that's my take. I'm aware that this is going to provoke some people, but I care about my country as well, and I'm sick and tired of the anti-British jibes coming from this joke of a network, We All News. I mean, from what I can see, I'll close with this. I know I said I'd close on a positive note, and I will. India is a democracy. There's many voices, but I will say this. Um, We All News. It has never ever said a positive thing about this country. I'm not I'm not saying that they can't criticize British policy, but it's never positive. It's this constant tirade of negativity, and I'm fed up with it. And from what I've noticed, the only people who support this network tends to be hyper nationalistic Indians or those who have a chip on their shoulder, have a grievance with the West. Um, that's how I see it. So yeah, I'd also say there's racist elements to We All News on the grounds that they talk about the British people in very negative ways as well, not just the British government. I remember a few years ago there was some football hooligans who, as they always do, embarrassed us. They caused trouble at I think it was a UEFA event on in Belgium, I believe. But instead of saying that football hooligans caused trouble, WION News spoke about they as in the British. So what WION News does is it stirs up hatred against the British people. That, by definition, is racist, and I think it should be called out for that reason. This isn't just a case of criticising the government. WION News is anti-British. It criticises the British people. It condemns the British people. When Rishi Sunak became prime minister, it spoke about they, mocked him. And they were talking about racism Sunak had experienced. They ignore the fact that this country made him prime minister in our system. His party made him prime minister in our system. He has literally got to the most powerful political position in the land. Um, so again, it's just we all news trying to stir up negativity where there is none, and I'm fed up with it. So, as a final note, I would say we shouldn't treat India as an enemy or an adversary, but nor should we go out of our way to pander to India so long as this respect is only one way. Why should we go out of our way to show excessive respect to Modi's India when it doesn't respect us? When its nationalist mouthpieces are coming out with this all the time, all the time. So I'll leave it there. But as far as I'm concerned, WION News is a disgrace to journalism, and it's an anti-West mouthpiece.